Well, good morning and welcome to Copernicus. My name is Sarah and I'm so happy you're here today. For those of you who don't know, Copernicus is a Bible study. We meet on Sunday mornings, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for about an hour. And anytime you can catch us, whether it's live or on replay, we'd love to have you. So we are in the second week of a 2-week series called Rahab. And really, it's more than a 2-week series. We are learning about women of the Bible, and Rahab is second in the lineup. So we're in the second week of Rahab, and let's just talk about it for a minute. Okay, if y'all didn't watch it, you need to go back and watch it so you know what we're talking about. But you have to think, okay, so Rahab had instructions. She had to get all of her family into her home and not tell them why before there was like this, assault. And she had to put this rope, this red rope in the window so that they knew this is where, don't go in there, these are good people. I want you to stop and think about it. I don't know if you know my family, but you know your family. Would you be able to get your family all in one place together and say, I can't tell you why? Would they do that? Would they think about that? That's a lot. That's a lot to handle. So anyway, that just always stands out in my mind. She did it. They did it. It was good. So anyway, we are going to wrap up Rahab this week, and then we're going to move on to the next woman of the Bible. So you just stick with us. Again, if you missed Ruth, go back, catch up on Rahab 1, and then we're going to finish it up today. We're thrilled you're here, and we're turning it over to Tim.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. And we are going to finish our Rahab story this week. But first, let me tell you about what's going to happen next week. So next week, we are going to be looking at the story of Tamar. And let me just tell you, this is a wild ride, okay? It's going to be a 2-week series. It's lots of fun. This is a very unusual story. It's just full of strange, bizarre things that happen. And it's going to challenge our 21st century mind. It just is. And you're going to be here for the whole thing because it's an unexpected tale of unexpected magnitude. And it'll probably blow your mind that it's actually in the Bible. So anyway, next week, I'm going to be here for that. And now let's get going on ours. So we started Rahab last week, and we're going to pick that story up this week and wrap it up. We told you that it's in the 6th book of your Bible, the book of Joshua. And if you missed last week, you can go back and watch it on replay. And you'll want to do that because we learned a whole bunch about how we got to this part of the story. So let's take a look at Jericho again. Remember, this mound right here is about 7 city blocks. And this is the remains of what Joshua and his people would have seen when they got to Jericho. And it's a really cool place. Joshua is the new leader of the Israelites after Moses died. And you remember last week he sent 2 spies into Jericho and the surrounding area to check out the enemy, see what it looks like. And so the 2 spies, they go into the promised land. Remember, it was their land before, but they left, and now God told them to come back and reclaim it. So they go into the city of Jericho, and they wind up at a hotel run by a prostitute named Rahab. And this turned out for them to be a great place to get information. It also turns out that it was a great place for the king of Jericho to get information. And so he sends for Rahab and says, hey, I heard that there are 2 guys in your hotel. You need to send them back to me because they're spies. And she says, oh, no. I sent those guys out. I didn't know who they were, but they already left. But they weren't really left. They weren't really gone. They hadn't left yet. They were still upstairs on the roof under the flax, and they were hiding. And so now the walls have closed in on the spies. Literally, the gates have closed in on the spies, and they are stuck inside the house. But Rahab has a plan, and here's the plan. So she let them down by a rope through the window, for the house she lived in was part of the city wall. And so as it turns out, this little line is this verse right here is a super important part of the whole story, because number 1, she lets them down by a rope, and number 2, the house she lives in was part of the city wall, and we'll come to that in just a second. And so then the men said to her, this oath you made us swear will not be binding on us unless when we enter the land you have tied the scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down. So her only hope for salvation was to let them see this red rope apparently she had used to let them out of the window, to leave it hanging out of the window so they would know which house was hers. And they said, keep your whole family and everybody inside the motel. because we can't protect you in a hand-to-hand combat outside, in the street. And so the scarlet cord would be the means that all the soldiers and Joshua's army would have to know that this house, nobody in this house was to die. So, as we said last week, the means of their escape, the means of their deliverance became the sign of hers. And so the really cool thing is that nobody in the story yet knows exactly what's going to happen. And that's where we come to today. So we're going to be in Joshua chapter 6. We're skipping over some chapters because we started in chapter 2 last week. And I know you want to read them all. That's really cool. But they're skipping over. And so this is where we're going to be. Joshua chapter 6. It's a really cool story. So let's jump right in, okay? Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. All right, so as we learned last week, the people of Jericho were afraid, and they were afraid of Israel's God, who had defeated Sihon and Og, and who had led them out of Egypt and through the Red Sea on dry land. That was a big deal to them, and so they were scared. Now, the way cities and walls operated in medieval times, in the Near East in these times, was a little different than what we might imagine. In this world, not everybody lived inside the city. So you couldn't plant row crops or, herd cattle inside the city because there are buildings there. And so people would live outside the city, but in times of danger, in times of war, people would come inside the city and they would lock the city gates, and then the king's army would protect them from the city walls or whatever. And so that's how it worked. And so inside was for protection, not necessarily for everyday living. It's where you could do business and that sort of thing, but primarily it was for protection. Now Jericho had an interesting system of walls, and this is a model that somebody has drawn up, and it's pretty cool. And you can see there are actually 2 sets of walls around the city of Jericho. And so this gave double protection. Plus, remember, Jericho's on a hill. And so the first wall would be high, but the second one would be higher than that. So to scale these walls, you can't just have one method. You're going to have to build, if you build siege platforms, you're going to have to build one here, and then you have to go out and build another one. And by that time, you're going to be toast. And so that's what the city of Jericho looked like. And this is what people paid taxes for, was the protection that this city offered. Okay? So let's jump right in to Joshua 6. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands along with its king and its fighting men." Do you remember the first verse where it said the whole thing is locked up? And you saw their walls. And God says, "See, I told you." It's like, I'm not seeing it yet. Okay? But this is what God said, and now he's going to God has a plan. He already knows the outcome, but we don't know what it is. So what is this terrifying plan that the God of the universe is going to wield against the people of Jericho, this little 7 blocks of whatever, right? Let's find out. God says, "March around the city once with all the armed men and do this for 6 days. And then build a siege ramp," right? Right? God says, "I'm not done yet. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. And then we build a siege ramp?" I mean, when are we going to do something to get inside the city? I don't know if you noticed, Lord, but the whole thing's locked up, right? I mean, this is a thing. So this is not making a ton of sense. So God knows exactly what he's doing, but he's not getting us in on the picture just yet. Now, there's another thing going on here. It's the 7 priests, and then the 7th day and 7 times. And so a lot of times we see 7, we think, "Ooh, that must mean something." Well, it does. It means 7 in this biblical thought is a way of saying something that's complete or perfect, right? Not necessarily sinless, but complete. And so he's like, the guy's like, "I've got a complete plan for this, and I'm going to show you how." And so he outlines how many of everything. And it's God's way of saying, "I know what I'm doing." But let's keep reading. God says, when you hear them sound, that's the trumpets, a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in. Seriously. Can you imagine being Joshua and having to go back and tell your guys, this is how we're going to do this? I mean, you got to convince an entire nation that we're going to scream really loud and the walls are going to fall down. So, I mean, it's like crazy, right? On the other hand, this is a march on a city of influence. Maybe they had got a lot of good press on it. I don't know. So, but here they are. This is the plan. Doesn't sound great. So he, that's Joshua, had the ark of the Lord carried around the city, circling it once. Then the army returned to the camp and spent the night there. Now we've jumped down to verse 11. You can read more. So this is day 1. Done. Nothing happened. Now, here's something we don't know, and as Americans we want to know this. How many people were in the army? Doesn't say. If there were 1,000 people in the army, that would be reasonable. 1,000 people in the army, they could have circled all of Jericho one deep all the way around and locked arms. If there were 3,000, it could have been three people deep all the way around, locked arms. So we don't know, but it's got to be quite a sight to see from the city gates, right? You got to be looking down from the walls going, what is going on? I imagine there were a lot of people that were checking it out. So Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priest took up the ark of the Lord. Okay, day 2. What are they going to do? Same thing. What's going to happen? Nothing, right? Just like it did yesterday. So the second day, they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. So what you got is you got an armed guard, you got trumpeters, you got the Ark of the Covenant on the shoulders of the priests, you have more armed guards, and you have all people following all that every day, all around the city, and then they go home. Do it again, and go home. So can you imagine, like on the 3rd or 4th day, what are the people in Jericho thinking? They're like, what are they going to do? March us to death? What's going on? They don't know. On the 7th day, verse 15, on the 7th day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times. In the same manner, except on that day, they circled the city 7 times. So every day before it was once, and now they're going to do it 7 times. So the people at Jericho, it's just another day. They're going to march around. Oh, they're doing it twice. Oh, they're doing it 3 times. Oh, they're doing it 4, right? You see how this goes? And so now everybody knows this day is going to be different. Have you ever gone to work and you get there and you suddenly realize that something bad is going down at work? You ever done that? Because I have, right? This is going to be a bad day. This is what happened to Jericho. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. Now, just stop. Okay, first of all, they've been doing this for 6 days, now 7. On the 7th day, they did it a lot. I don't know about you, but I'm out of breath just thinking about walking around 7 city blocks 7 times, right? But they've done that. They've got a lot of pent-up energy that they've been holding up. They haven't said anything for 7 days while they've been doing this. And so now, Joshua has given them instruction. He gave them before. He said, when you hear the trumpet sound, you're going to shout. Now, what are the people of Jericho thinking when the trumpets blow this time? Okay. What's Rahab thinking? If this is your rescue plan, I'm in trouble, right? She's like, who knows? We don't know because the author doesn't tell us that, but here's what happens. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. This is what Joshua is saying. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared because she hid the spies we sent. He said, so this obviously happened before the final shout, right? And he says, look, everything in the city is devoted to the Lord. And by devoted to the Lord, he means we're not taking any of it. It all stays. We're going to burn the whole thing down. Okay? Nothing's going to be left. It's the only thing that's going to be spared are people. Rahab, the prostitute. Remember how many times has he said prostitute so far? Rahab, the prostitute, and everybody that's with her in her house. And how would they know which house that is? There's a red cord hanging out of it. When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. Now, this is crazy, but I want you to show you a picture. It's not a great picture, but just kind of work with me, okay? If you haven't noticed, we jumped down to verse 20, so sorry about that. First of all, let's just think about how surprised the Israelites are. Hey, it worked. we didn't see that coming. But now they're excited, so they're gonna go do battle. What do you think the people in Jericho are thinking? You think they were surprised? A little, right? Or a lot, okay? But how could this happen in real life? I mean, I know you're skeptical. Let me show you. So you got two walls. I know it's not a great picture, but just use your imagination. You got two walls, one on the lower, one on the top. And so what we know from history and from archaeology is that each wall had a separate foundation of stones, okay, that was built on. So the walls were high, but from down here, it looked like the walls were twice as high as they were. You can see that, right? Plus, you're going uphill. Who has the better? If you're going uphill, the people stand on this gate, on this wall, even if you get through this one, they still have the higher ground. It's still a strategic advantage. And so each one of these walls is about 4 stories high. And so according to history, the bricks fell outwards. Now here's another picture. You can see the bricks fell out. The walls fell out, which creates a siege ramp. Even if all the walls didn't fall down, you still got a good siege ramp that you can go right in. Same here. And so what we have is a big pile of bricks at the foundation, which created a ramp up the embankment. And the people of Jericho were so surprised, they didn't even have a defense. They didn't think anybody could get in their walls. And so the Israelites run in to where everybody that belongs to the city of Jericho is holed up. If they hadn't done it this way, they'd have to scatter all over the countryside and fight people who are doing row crops and cattle and all that stuff. Now God had a plan. He put everybody in one box and said, now take care of business. Okay? And so getting the wall shut up was God's strategy. Now skip down to verse 22. Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, now go into the prostitute's house and bring her out and all who belong to her in accordance with your oath to her. And so this was information that was given to them, instructions given to them before the battle. But now the battle's in full thing. He says, go get her. And so off they go to get her. Now, how many times has the guy told us that Rahab is a prostitute? I mean, this is obviously important to him. It's a bad way. Could he not have said it nicer? The hotel manager, everybody would have known. But no, he goes right there. Skip down to verse 23. Look at this. So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and mother, her brothers and sisters, and all who belonged to her. Now, let me ask you a question. Well, what kind of people are Rahab and her family? They're not exactly prisoners of war because they're kind of like refugees at this point in time, right? Okay, so they brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. They're not Jews. They're not prisoners of war. They're just refugees. They don't have a place inside the city, not by Jewish standards. They had to stay outside, a place inside the camp. They had to stay outside the camp. They had their own place because they're not Jewish. Okay, and this is important. And you're going to see why in just a couple of verses. So just kind of hang in there with me. Then they burned, that's the Israelites, they burned the whole city and everything in it, but they put the silver and the gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. Now, we'll stop here for just a second and just think about this. This is the description of a holy war, and you may not like it, and I understand that. It seems very cruel in our day, it seems barbaric, and I understand all that, and it is, okay? But this was a common military practice in that part of the world. And it was a language that everybody there understood, and God spoke it without a stutter. He didn't hesitate. Now we have descriptions of the Moabites, we have descriptions of the Canaanites doing the same thing. But here's what you have. So they burn everything in the city, but there are some things that won't burn. Silver, gold, things like that. But here's what doesn't happen. They don't get to plunder and get rich off of it. This goes in to the treasury of the Lord's house. And where was the Lord's house? Well, it was a tent right now. It wasn't a house yet. It was a tent. And so this is not, and just I want you to understand this is not simple genocide or killing a group of people on the basis of ethnicity. It's not. It's not a conquest for land. It was their land. It was what God had given them. It wasn't for attaining wealth. That's not what it was for. They burn it so that nobody else could use it. That was the point. Nobody gets to keep this little plot of land for them and their family. Okay? This is not genocide because we don't like you. This is God's judgment. He uses people to do it. This is God's judgment on humans who have wrecked the image of God. And God says, enough. This brings up a question, and we need to talk about it. So, in our world, we like a God who is loving and compassionate and merciful. Those are the words that we like when we talk about God. And that's totally understandable, because I want somebody who's going to be loving, compassionate, and merciful to me, right? And you probably do too, especially when I make mistakes, and I make a bunch of them on a regular basis. Look, you're watching me talk. You know I make mistakes. So the question we have is, why would a loving, compassionate, merciful God punish people to death? Why would he do that? And that is a good question. It is one side of a question, and we need to ask the other side. Okay, so let's ask the other side. If God is just, holy, and righteous, if sin must be punished, if God is uniquely separate from everybody else and his definition of good rules, if he is in right relationship with his definition of good and with all humans, why is he so patient with the people who not only don't believe in him, but rebel against him and do their own gross, nasty, evil definitions of good? And so we have to ask both questions, and both questions are good. Now, again, I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again. We like to say that only God can judge, and here he did. Joshua didn't say, hey, I think we want to kill these people. God said, you have to destroy this nation. And why? Because they're an affront to my image. They have taken my image, they've twisted it so bad that you can't see me in them anymore. And so, if you're going to say only, and I'm not saying you do, but I hear people all the time, if you're going to say that only God can judge, you can't read these passages and be mad that he did. That would be kind of hypocritical to be upset when God does what you said he's allowed to do. Now, let's keep reading, and hopefully some of this other stuff will make more sense. Verse 25, but Joshua spared Rahab seriously? Rahab the prostitute, again, with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua sent as spies to Jericho. Okay, so at first, she was outside the camp. She's a foreigner. She might have been treated less than, pleasantly because she wasn't part of Israel. And she's a prostitute, for crying out loud. And whatever else she was, is she any use to the Israelites now? No. We saved her. She's good. But look at how this verse ends. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. You see what happened? Something changed. She went from being, and her whole family being outside the camp, to becoming Jewish, to taking on their way of living, to worshiping Yahweh, their God, to adhering to their customs. She got more than just being saved from God's judgment. She got a whole new life. And that wasn't even part of the original deal. All she wanted was her life. So, there are a few questions that thinking people may have when reading the story. We've talked about some of them. But why does this story paint such a grim picture of Rahab? Why does this writer constantly, unashamedly refer to her as the prostitute? Okay, why is this story even in the Bible, right? And what does the story of Rahab have to do with anything? Well, that's a great question, and we're going to talk about that just for a second. So to answer that question, what we're going to do is jump forward about 1,400 years. And we're going to go to the book of Matthew. Matthew is the first book in the New Testament. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, right? So if you go to the second half of your Bible, it's the first book in the second half of your Bible. Matthew was written by a Jew. It was written to Jews. It was written about Jewish stuff. And so it was intended for Jewish people to understand it first. Now we can get in on the secret, and I'm going to help you with that. And so at the top of the list for Jewish things is a Jewish Messiah, someone who can save us, who can rescue us. Now originally, the Jewish Messiah was intended to rescue the world and his image bearers. But at this point in time, the people of Israel are now, they're in bondage to a different person, to a different group of people. This time, they are now occupied by Romans. They're in a Roman occupation. They are overtaxed. They are oppressed. They are enslaved in many cases. Roman soldiers walk the street and abuse people. And the Jewish people were believing that God would send them a deliverer from Rome. And they had prophecies predicting that a man would be born who would deliver Israel from their enemies. Remember, it's a man that would be born, and they called that man the Messiah. Now, because Jewish people were looking for a Jewish Messiah who would be a man, they kept super detailed records of their men. Okay? Now, you may say, well, that's patriarchal. Why did it have to be a man? It wasn't just a man that was in the picture. Remember, it'd be a man born of a woman. Okay, so women were in the picture too. They had a very important part. And so, but what they kept track of was their men. That was the thing they needed to know which one was going to be the Messiah. Now, before you get all upset about it, just think about this. If we tell the story of Cinderella, who's the main character? Well, it's not the prince. It's Cinderella. The prince is important, but he is an add-on character a little later on. He's not the most important thing. Okay? So you can think that this story is patriarchal, but you're going to miss the point if you get stuck on that. Okay? When they said the Messiah would be a man, and they kept track of men, when you see a woman's name in a Jewish genealogy, you got to stop and ask yourself, why is she in here? Because we don't keep track of the women for Messiah's purposes. We keep track of men. And so we're going to look at Matthew chapter 1. We're going to start in a little bit in verse 3. It starts with the word Perez. That's a person's name. Now, if you were here for Ruth, you recognize this, right? You recognize this. And so, but if you don't know who he is, just hang in there. I'm going to show you. Perez, the father of Hezron, Hezron, the father of Ram, Ram, the father of Amminadab, Amminadab, the father of Nahshon, Nahshon, the father of Salmon. So he started with Abraham, and he's just going through the genealogy, and everybody's like yawning. Don't stop yawning for a second. If you were here for Rachel, you might remember this guy's name, Salmon, or Salmon, however you pronounce that. Okay? If you think you know that one, you probably do. Salmon was the father of Boaz. You remember him, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz was the father of Obed, and whose mother was Ruth. Now, let's just stop here. Boaz, his mother was Rahab. Probably not literally. She was probably like his great-great-great-grandmother. Okay? But that's how they talked back then. To say that someone is your son or your daughter doesn't necessarily mean they're your son or your daughter. It could mean that you're the granddaughter, grandson, whatever. Okay? And so for those of you here with Ruth, you remember this story of Boaz and Ruth. They got married. They had a son named Obed, and that was part of that story. And then Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of King David. So just think about this for a second. Rahab the prostitute was the great-great-great-great-grandmother of King David. That's remarkable. Because she didn't sign up for that. She just wanted to be saved. And so Matthew doesn't stop here, though. Listen to what he says. It says, thus there were 14 generations in all, from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile in Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. And so well, good news. The deliverer has come, the Messiah has come, and he came through a prostitute is in his family line. Why would you include that little tidbit in your family line if you're going to be the king of the world? And this is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. Matthew believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and that Jesus the Messiah came from a line of people that included, but was not limited to, a prostitute. By the way, this may be helping you figure out why Boaz was so kind to Ruth, because in his family history, someone had been kind to his great-great-grandmother when she didn't really deserve it. See how this works? Matthew did not only believed that the deliverer would descend from a Canaanite, a prostitute, and a liar, but that this same deliverer would rescue Canaanites, prostitutes, and liars. That's the good news. And it's unheard of, which means we have to pay attention to it. So, why does the prostitute who lies to escape death and get in the family of the deliverer of Israel and of the world? Because her body may have been used, her lips may have been foul, and her culture and world might be corrupt. But the Messiah descended from such people to deliver them and her from his own judgment. God is not wanting, his desire is not to send people into punishment. His desire is to rescue them from certain death. And so, you remember this verse from last week? Proverbs 9:10, the beginning of the wisdom is to fear the Lord. The word is meant to capture both the drawing near and drawing back at the same time. Do we deserve this kind of judgment from God? Yes. Does God love us enough to spare us from it? Also, yes. And so the God who controls the events on earth and in heaven can judge you. And that's scary. But only He can save you. And that makes it worth drawing near to Him. Now, the rest of the verse says, the beginning of the wisdom is to fear the Lord, and acknowledging the Holy One is understanding. So God is who He says He is, not who I say He is. And so when we come to this God, we don't make him up. We come to him as he's revealed himself, or we don't come at all. And when we come to this God and recognize that we should be afraid, but that he loves us enough to keep us from having to live that way, well, that's good news. And that's the beginning of understanding. And so that leaves us with two choices. Remember these choices from last week? Remember, Jericho committed its safety to a set of walls and gates that they could see and manage. And everybody in Jericho died. So that wasn't a very good plan. But Rahab committed her safety to a God that she couldn't see, that she only heard stories about. And she lived. And not only did she live, she found more than life. And so as humans now, we can choose security in our own definition of good, and we will die. Or we can commit our safety to the God of the Bible and his definition of good, and in drawing near to him, we live. So Rahab asked for life any way God chose to give it to her. And God gave her more than she asked for. Acknowledging God for who he is rather than who we want him to be often begins with fear, but it doesn't have to stay there. It ends in restoration and in transformation, inclusion and love. And can I tell you something? Just pay attention to this for a second. Jesus, the deliverer, provided deliverance for Rahab the prostitute beyond what she asked. Yeah, the whole story in Jericho is one story, but he saved her from more than just death in Jericho, but potentially from her sin, from her definition of good. And she only had to do one thing, which was believe and evidence that by putting out the scarlet cord. That was all. Why did she need saving? Because she was going to die inside those walls with her entire city. She risked something, and she hung that cord out, and she was saved. So Jesus provided deliverance for Rahab the prostitute beyond what she asked because he wanted to include Rahab the prostitute in his family. That's remarkable. She didn't just get inside the town, the people of Israel. She got inside history. She got inside his story. And finally, it was because he loved Rahab the prostitute more than she could imagine. That's remarkable. This woman didn't think about God loving her. She thought about fearing him because of his power. And yet God loved her enough to give her a place in his story, even before she knew what she needed. Now, why do I say this? And here's why. Because Jesus provided deliverance for you, you fill in the blank. What are you? So I'm not a prostitute. Well, that's great. What are you? Because whatever you've done, wherever you've been, and wherever you may be, Jesus provided deliverance for you beyond what you asked. Because he wanted to include you, whatever you are, wherever you've been, whoever you've done it wrong to, in his family. And he did that because he loves you, the whatever you are, more than you could possibly imagine. Whoever you are, you can consider this Jesus. You and I are right to fear God because of his power to judge us. But we are also right to trust him for his love to save us. And that's wise. It's an act of faith. So, if you dare to approach this God, you, like many others, like many of us, will find it's worth far more than you can imagine. You're free to consider this Jesus, no matter where you come from, no matter who you are, no matter what you've done. And if you have any questions about that kind of relationship, please contact us at copernicuslife.com. We would love to help you take the next steps. Let me pray with you. Well, Father, we are grateful for your love and for this story, and for the fact that while we should be terrified of the judgment that you could pour out on us for choosing our own definition of good, we can draw near to you because of the love you've expressed to us in your Son, Jesus. And it's in his name that we pray all these things. Amen.